The wind came down from the mountains like a restless spirit that evening, cold and sharp, sweeping across the empty prairie and bending the tall winter grass in long silver waves. Snow had fallen the night before, thin and powdery, just enough to turn the land pale beneath the rising moon. Out on that lonely stretch of frontier there were no towns for miles, only a scattering of cabins and the endless silence of the wilderness. Inside one of those cabins a fire burned steadily in a stone hearth. The flames flickered orange and gold, pushing back the darkness that pressed against the small windows. The cabin belonged to a man named Daniel Carter, though most folks who knew him simply called him Dan. He had lived alone there for nearly 8 years. Dan sat on a wooden chair near the fire, his boots stretched toward the warmth. His coat hung on a peg by the door, still dusted with snow from the day's work. A battered kettle rested over the flames, quietly beginning to steam. The scent of pine logs and boiling coffee filled the small room. He had always liked the quiet. After years of riding cattle trails and sleeping under open skies, the stillness of his little homestead felt like a reward. No shouting cowboys, no stampeding herds, no trouble. Just the wind, the fire, and the slow passing of time. Outside, the wind howled again. Dan lifted his head slightly, listening. The prairie was full of sounds if a man learned to hear them: the call of an owl, the shifting of branches, the distant cry of a coyote. But this sound was different, a knock, soft at first, almost lost in the wind. Dan frowned. He stayed still for a moment, thinking he might have imagined it. Nobody traveled out here at night, especially not in winter. Then the knock came again. 3 quick taps against the wooden door. Dan stood slowly, his chair creaking behind him. He crossed the room with cautious steps and reached for the rifle that leaned beside the door. He didn't aim it, just held it loosely in one hand as he unlatched the door. Cold air rushed in as he opened it. For a moment he saw nothing but snow and darkness. Then he noticed a figure standing a few steps from the porch. A woman. She was wrapped in a thin shawl that the wind whipped mercilessly around her shoulders. Snow clung to her hair and the hem of her dress. Her hands trembled as she clutched the fabric close to her chest. Her face was pale from the cold, but her eyes held a quiet determination. She looked up at him and spoke softly, her voice almost lost in the wind. "May I warm up by your fire?" Dan blinked in surprise. He had expected many things in life's storms: cattle rustlers, bad harvests, but not a lone woman appearing at his door in the middle of a winter night. He studied her for a moment. She couldn't have been more than 25. Her dress was worn but clean, and her boots were thin for this kind of weather. She looked exhausted, as though she had walked a long distance. Without another word, Dan stepped aside. "Come in," he said. The woman hurried inside, and the door shut behind her with a dull thud. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around her immediately. She moved closer to the fire, holding out her frozen hands. For several minutes neither of them spoke. Dan poured a cup of coffee and handed it to her. She accepted it gratefully, her fingers still shaking. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Long walk?" Dan asked. She nodded. "Too long." He waited, but she didn't explain further. Dan wasn't the sort of man who pushed strangers with questions. Out here on the frontier, people sometimes carried stories they weren't ready to tell. So he simply added another log to the fire. The flames crackled louder. After a while, the warmth began to bring color back to the woman's face. She removed her shawl and draped it over the chair. Her dark hair fell loose around her shoulders, still damp with melting snow. "My name is Emily," she said finally. "Dan," he replied. She looked around the cabin. It was simple. Just a table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, and shelves filled with tools and supplies. "But it was clean and warm. You live here alone?" she asked. "Have for a while." Emily nodded thoughtfully. Outside, the wind rattled the window shutters. "Where were you headed?" Dan asked. Emily stared into the fire. "I don't rightly know any more." The words hung in the air. Dan watched her quietly. There was something in her voice, something tired, something wounded. "You running from something?" he asked gently, "or towards something?" She gave a small, sad smile. "Maybe both." The firelight danced across her face, revealing faint lines of worry that seemed older than her years. "I used to live in a town east of here," she began slowly, "a small place called Ridge Hollow. My father owned a general store. When he passed away last year, the store went to my uncle." Dan nodded, listening. "He wasn't a kind man," Emily continued. "He said a woman had no business owning property. Said I should marry and let a husband handle things." Her fingers tightened around the coffee cup. "He arranged a marriage for me, a man twice my age. I barely knew him." Dan's jaw tightened slightly. "And you left," he said. Emily nodded. "Last night." Silence settled again. Dan looked into the fire for a long moment before speaking. "Well," he said quietly, "anyone who can walk through a winter storm alone has more courage than most folks I know." Emily looked up at him in surprise. "You don't think I was foolish?" Dan shook his head. "No." He paused before adding something that would stay with her forever. "I think a person who fights for their own life ain't foolish at all." The words struck her like a sudden beam of sunlight breaking through clouds. For days, maybe months, she had carried the weight of doubt and fear. Everyone back home had told her she was wrong, selfish, reckless. But this stranger spoke as if her choice made perfect sense. Something in her chest loosened. She felt, for the first time since leaving home, that maybe she wasn't alone in the world. The storm outside grew stronger. Snow began tapping against the window. "You can stay here tonight," Dan said simply. "Storm's not letting up anytime soon." Emily hesitated. "You're sure?" "Got an extra blanket and enough firewood." A small smile touched her lips. "Thank you." That night, while the storm roared across the prairie, the two strangers sat by the fire and talked quietly for hours. Emily spoke about her childhood, her love of books, and how she had dreamed of traveling beyond Ridge Hollow someday. Dan told stories of cattle drives, dusty trails, and long sunsets over the open plains. As the fire burned low, Emily realized something surprising. She felt safe, safer than she had in a long time. Before going to sleep, Dan spread blankets near the fire for her while he took the small bed. The wind howled outside like a distant wolf, but inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire and the quiet kindness of a stranger made the world feel different. Emily lay awake for a while, staring at the ceiling beams. She kept hearing Dan's words in her mind. "A person who fights for their own life ain't foolish at all." For the first time since leaving home, she allowed herself to believe that her future might hold more than fear. Morning came slowly. The storm had passed, leaving the world buried beneath fresh snow that sparkled in the pale sunlight. Emily stepped outside and gasped softly. The prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, untouched and beautiful. Behind her, Dan stood in the doorway. Still plenty of road ahead. He said. She turned to him. "Yes," she replied. "But for the first time, that doesn't scare me." Dan nodded. And though neither of them knew it yet, the simple moment when a woman knocked on a stranger's door and asked to warm herself by his fire had quietly changed both of their lives forever.